Good evening and thank you for joining us on Sunday Interview. I'm your host, Gravazio Zulu. The constitution-making process has continued to be a source of debate, with parties and interest groups failing to reach consensus on the best way forward. With the NDF done and the draft constitution bill now before Parliament, groups across the divide are queuing up to either denounce the bill and the process as a sham or to support the process as progressive. Is this where the nation intended to be at the start of the constitution review process? My guest this evening is Chief Parliamentary Whip and Patriotic Front Legal Chairperson, Honorable Brian Mundubile. Sir, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Gravazio. I'm happy to be here this evening.
Now, to start with, the National Dialogue Forum is done with deliberations. We're almost at an enactment stage and the bill is before Parliament. Would you say you have achieved the objectives of the NDF?
Yes, Gravazio, I think so far so good. As you know, the Constitutional Amendment Bill came up for first reading last Friday, and it's been referred to committee. So committee starts the sittings around the 2nd of September, which will go for almost a month. You know, witnesses will come up to make further submissions to the process. So I would say so far so good.
Mm-hmm. Now, civil society, parties and other interest groups are lining up to denounce the Constitutional Amendment Bill and NDF outcomes. Is this what you expected?
Well, first of all, Gravazio, what is important to note is that when you in a bid to achieve consensus, it will not be 100%. This is a democratic dispensation, you know, where people are expected to air their views. Now, the question is this where we expect it to be at this particular time? You are aware that some organizations boycotted the NDF, and obviously we didn't expect fair comments, you know, from them at this stage. But what is important maybe to note there is that when you look at Section 5 of the NDF Act, it provides for the delegates to the NDF. So when you again look at the many voices, or the voices, you know, that are speaking against the NDF bill, and you look at the numbers, clearly, if your question is on consensus, you realize that there are more, participants that participated in the NDF than those that went against it. There's a general impression that a number of organizations or individuals are speaking against the NDF. But my own observation is that that may be not the case.
Maybe we're looking at it in terms of weight, in terms of credibility, in terms of issues of integrity, if I should define it that way. You're looking at the Law Association of Zambia. You're looking at the Oasis Forum. You're looking at the NGOCC. You're looking at many other, let's look at church mother bodies. And they've all spoken against these.
Yes.
These are, in the past, what the nation has called the voice of reason.
Yes, Gravazio, you've accounted for predominantly NGOs and civil society organizations. How many MPs are speaking against NDF? How many political parties are speaking against NDF? So clearly, when you look at the composition at the NDF did not only look at one category of people. In this particular case, you've accounted mostly for CSOs. By law, Gravazio, members of parliament sitting in parliament alone can amend the constitution by 2/3. So clearly, they play a very key role, you know, in constitution amendment. Now, when you look at the groups that have gone to speak against the NDF, you don't hear any MPs speaking against the NDF. You haven't heard any political parties speaking against the NDF.
We've heard MPs from the UPND speak against the NDF.
Well, of course, that's a given.
We've heard political parties like NAREP and PAPE and others speak against the NDF.
There are a few, of course, political parties, and that was expected. Like I said earlier, those that did not attend, it was expected that they won't have any good comments or fair comments on the NDF. But clearly, we have a number of political parties in Zambia. We have a number of MPs in Zambia. We have a number of NGOs and CSOs that actually attended or participated in the NDF. Churches. We had a number of church leaders that were actually chairing committees at the NDF. So what you see, Gravazio, if I may just take you back, it may seem as if there are a number of voices that are speaking against the NDF. But what I want to say is that it's a small group of people that are visiting a number of places. If that group is not in Monze, you won't hear anything about the NDF. If they're not in Western Province, there'll be nothing that will be said about the NDF. When you hear something said about the NDF in Wapula, there's some obvious names that you hear that they're in Wapula. So quite frankly, the numbers that attended the NDF, to those that are against it, it's there for everybody to see.
But for lack of a better word, are you rubbishing the Law Association of Zambia, for instance? They've raised pertinent issues. There's the Oasis Forum. They've raised pertinent issues. These are important issues being raised by NGO. And according to explanation, there seems to be polarization. Political parties on the other side, the NGO world on the other side. Yes,
as to whether we're rubbishing what Law Association of Zambia and the others are saying, the answer is no. You see, this is a process, Grivazio. It's a process that was started. And, in this process, there are a number of submissions that are being made. At the NDF, people came up with submissions. Those submissions were taken on board and are reduced into resolutions. What you also needed to realize was that the process did not end at the NDF. Because from the NDF, as provided for by Section 14 of the NDF Act, the process now was to be taken to Parliament, where, as we are now, the Constitutional Amendment Bill is now referred to committee. So during this process, we expect people to participate by way of submissions, make their submissions. The only concern we have, however, Grivazio, is that, firstly, even for those that initially said that boycotted the process, they did not boycott the process after all, because soon after we saw a lot of excitement and a lot of contributions. Now, our advice to them, our guidance is that, look, it's not too late in the day to be part of the process. The resolutions or the bills have now gone to committee. Why don't you go and make your submissions to the committee? Because if somebody comes up and puts up a public discussion at Intercontinental this evening to discuss the Constitutional Amendment Bill, it's just an exercise for academic purposes. Because
sensitization, they have to sensitize the public on what is contained in the bill. Doesn't that help you in decision making? It should.
It will be more effective. It will be more effective if they actually went and submitted. Because what will happen now, what will be persuasive will be the report that will come from the committee. So in as much as they would want to go all over, go to Kaputa and sensitize, the bills are now before Parliament. So maybe they could retreat and come to committee and submit at Parliament. It will be more effective.
Now, here's one verdict. I must have read it from one of the statements, I think from the NGOCC, where it's clearly stated that this process started as a political process, anchored on the Siavonga resolutions, which were all attended by politicians. And ideally, this shouldn't be expected. It was unlikely that it was going to bring out a people-centered constitution.
That may be inaccurate, Grivazio. Allow me a minute or two, maybe just to give some brief background to the process so that you understand it as not being a process that was started by politicians. In 2016, there was a private member's bill in Parliament asking, government to consider amendment of the Constitution. And further, there was a lot of talk after the 2016 elections regarding the 14 days, the court processes and the rest. And then we heard about the tension in the country. The President of the Republic of Zambia, Mr. Edgar Chagwa Lungu, opened up and said, look, if there's so much tension in the country, why don't we have dialogue? Now, arising from that, the Zambia Center for Inter-Party Dialogue assembled what they called the National Democratic Stakeholder Summit, NDSS, at Mulungushi, where all stakeholders, civil society organizations, NGOs, political parties, churches, were called to discuss. And in the discussions there were to look at what was causing tension in the country. Arising from that meeting, it was established that most of the tension was between the political parties, and therefore resolved that political parties needed to have a platform upon which they should discuss and resolve the issues that they felt were contentious. And then came the Siavonga resolutions. We may not want to go that far. The Siavonga resolutions came up with 4 thematic areas. I remember at that meeting, we're talking about dialogue and reconciliation. UPND, representatives from UPND came out very clearly to say, look, we do not even need reconciliation. Once the causes of tension are addressed, there will be no need for reconciliation. And now came the 4 thematic areas, which were constitutional and institutional reform, separation of powers and judicial independence, civility in politics, freedom of assembly vis-a-vis the Public Order Act, and the Electoral Process Act. So these were the 4 areas that all political parties agreed to address. And it was therefore agreed that once these are addressed, even the tension that is being talked about, will no longer be in subsistence. Now, when all that was happening, Ministry of Justice, arising from the private members' motion, went around the country to get submissions from citizens generally on what citizens felt needed to be amended in the Constitution. So to correct the assertion by NGOCC that this was started by a political process, as a matter of fact, there was one process done by Ministry of Justice, collecting submissions from citizens generally. Then there was the Siavonga resolutions, and then there was a window for the churches. So when you look at the NDF Act, it's actually centered on these 3 principal documents. One, the Constitutional Amendment Bill, what we call the zero draft, and then the Siavonga resolutions and submissions from the church. So it's not so much that
it's a political process.
No.
You would argue that it's probably an all-encompassing process, but clearly signs now are that in this process there's no consensus, and chances are that the outcome of the process will be based on numbers more than acceptance.
No, like I said earlier, if you were to go through the voices that are speaking against it, these are voices that never supported this process from the beginning. And of course the issues are many. There were those that felt this process should have been a church-led process. But you and I know that that process, first of all, was not structured. We stayed for 7 months. When ZCID appealed to the minister, to the president, to delay the process of presenting the Constitutional Amendment Bill to allow for the dialogue process, the president immediately directed the Minister of Justice to halt the process. And for 7 months, nothing happened. And the reasons? The reasons were that the church and ZCID could not agree on the text in the MOU. Now, Zambians had been waiting for 7 months, and there was nothing going on. Now, what you have out of the NDF is actually a structured process, a process that is governed by law, a process that was transparent, that was inclusive, that was accountable, espousing the very principles in constitutional making. Grivazio, I'll take you to a document. This is a document that was done by one of our very own prominent constitutional lawyers in the name of Mundubile and Chaloka Beani. Mundubile from Cornell University and Chaloka Beani from London School of Economics and Political Science. This was done over 10 years ago. Now, when you look at this document was properly crafted. I'll take you to page 2. I'll just pick a few, and maybe read out paragraph 6. It says, of all previous drafts, the most progressive draft and one that appears to have the most support is that which resulted from the Mungomba Commission. It should therefore form the basis for the future constitution of Zambia. The approach to the making of the new constitution of Zambia must build on the past. It must be participatory and guided by dialogue, debate, consultation, and participation. Additionally, it should be guided by diversity, autonomy, accountability, and legitimacy. The process must be empowering to civil society organizations. So, just in paragraph 6, Grivazio, Professor Mundubile and Chaloka Beani defined the NDF.
Mundubile is back. He'll probably be presenting at the event you mentioned on the constitution making process. He has reservations.
Yes, I'll go further so that we expose the facts for what they are. In paragraph 8, it goes on to say, the making of the new constitution in Zambia will require a legitimate, transparent, and agreed statutory framework, setting out the process, principles, mechanisms, accountability, and timelines. And this is exactly the NDF Act. It goes on further to say, on suggested steps, it is suggested that there should be no more review commissions to collect views of the public. This is what Professor Mundubile says. the views of Zambians on future constitution for Zambia have been adequately canvassed through several previous commissions indicated above. There is no need to go into it again, in light of several previous commissions already referred to. And in paragraph C, he says the committee should adopt its own rules of procedure.
So in short, you're trying to say Professor Munandulo backed.
Yes.
He
could have done it 10 years earlier. He could have done it
coming,
yes,
but he backed it. But again,
yes,
these issues that you've mentioned are very subjective. You've talked about dialogue.
Yes.
It should be consultative. It should be legitimate. And these are the issues people are querying. And these are the issues civil society is saying there was not enough dialogue. There was not enough consultation. They're saying NDF probably was not that legitimate in terms of acceptance.
Because I just talked about NDSS. It was all inclusive. National Democratic Stakeholder Summit. I talked about the Siavonga meeting, where all political parties signed a communique. All political parties signed that communique. Further, when you look at Section 5 of the NDF Act, look at representation. Because like I said earlier, let's not lose sight of the fact that MPs alone sitting in Parliament can amend the Constitution by 2/3. So all MPs were part of the NDF. But on top of that, we had all political parties represented at the NDF. We had the churches, the NGOs, the Law Association of Zambia itself. So in terms of inclusiveness, maybe Grivasium, we can look at it from the other side. Let's assume that all those that went to the NDF step aside and we ask for an alternative forum. Who is going to be at that forum? If we're going to look at consensus now, who is going to be at that other forum? Because one, the proposals that we're getting now from the people, they are proposing an arbitrary process of just getting an eminent person without any legal structure, without any transparency, and say, sit here and chair a dialogue.
Are you forcing consensus on people?
No, no.
Are you forcing them to agree that, yes, there is consensus? Yes, they were consulted. Now they're telling you there isn't enough. Why are you not listening to them? If Laz says, well, there isn't enough consensus on this, there isn't enough consultation, this bill is arbitrary, it's draconian. Are you listening?
I'm a member of Laz, and Laz was represented at the forum. Laz was represented
the last council sat and is now making recommendations to you.
Well, I think from what I've read, at one point I read some statement by the president of Laz in his personal capacity. I've seen something from him now in his capacity as chairperson for the Oasis Forum. So I think we need to be a bit careful when we refer to Laz in this particular case. Because
the last council actually threatened to take the matter to court.
No, first of all, I'm aware that there was a meeting at Intercontinental where it was resolved that there was need for us to call an extra on a general conference to discuss the NDF resolutions one by one. Because very clearly, what is coming out is that Laz, for instance, objected to 5 amendments. Now, out of 200 amendments, they've objected to 5. What's the meaning of that? Is that to say that the other 195 have been agreed to? That's a question that only Laz can answer. So the fact that people have picked out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 amendments and objected to them does not mean they've objected to the entire document that came out of the NDF. And I also want to repeat this, Grivasio. I think that there's a difference when you have the same group of people going from one province to the other. You cannot say the people of Zambia are rejecting this. It's the same voices in Wapula. It's the same voices speaking in Western Province. You see them on TV. So if it's not, for instance, Prime TV, giving coverage to this, who else is talking about these things? Let's be very cautious. Let's warn ourselves, because there will be an impression that will be given that the Zambian people have risen against the NDF, when it's the same group of people that are trotting from province to province. And those names,
of course, the NGOCC has given an objective analysis of the NDF resolution.
Yes.
I would call it objective because they called some ideas as progressive and others as retrogressive.
And that's what I want to hear.
You accept?
That is normal.
Have some retrogressive causes.
I'll tell you something, Grivazio. Even for us as PF MPs, we didn't agree on everything as we were there. But we're driven by the principles of consensus. In terms of consensus, you can't be rigid. Just because we didn't agree with something, when we went to plenary, the structure of the NDF, Grivazio, if I may outline that, we broke into 4 committees. So the 4 committees discussed and came up with resolutions. These were now brought to plenary for final adoption. And the number of positions changed when we were there. You also must understand that looking at the zero draft, looking at the Savunga resolutions and submissions from the church, it was discovered that there were certain items, there were certain articles and clauses in the Constitution that were not captured by these 3 documents, but yet needed refinement or needed amendment. The forum, by Section 4, had the power to add, subtract, and amend. For instance, the issue of deputy ministers, it rose as a secondary item within the forum. The issue of coalition government, it arose as a secondary item in the forum. And secondary items in that regard were those items that were not initially captured by the zero draft, not initially captured by the Savunga resolutions, and not initially captured by submissions from the church. So this is what was happening there. It was a very, very transparent a process that was full of dialogue, because even between the Patriotic Front members of parliament, as chairman for legal, I would call them and say, okay, gentlemen, there's this thing has come up. What is our position? We would even differ openly on that position. Why? Because our party had allowed us to go to the NDF, getting submissions from our people in the constituencies. So I went there with the position from Mporokoso, because before I went to the NDF, I'd been to Mporokoso. The people in Mporokoso had also an opportunity to submit to the Ministry of Justice-led process. So when I was going to get their views, it's not that they were only submitting their views through the Honorable Member of Parliament. They also had an opportunity to submit directly to that process.
Now, the Constitution, by its nature, is a supreme law of the land, and it should express a collective will of the people. Do you think this draft does that?
Like I said, Grivazio, it does just that. And why do I say so? And I keep repeating that. If you look at the composition in Section 5 of the NDF Act, you realize that you have an all-inclusive forum involving civil servants, involving the judiciary, the legislature, the churches, the political parties, and everybody else. Some of the groups, Grivazio, that you're referring to, are maybe just from one category. These are just maybe NGOs that are speaking to that. And we're saying, assuming that all those that attended the NDF stepped aside and said, yes, okay, can we look at the alternative forum? Who is going to be at that forum? That's a question that one would want to address. And the answer lies in there when you talk about consensus. The moment you take everybody that attended the NDF aside and then ask for an alternative forum, you then realize that indeed the group at the NDF had consensus.
Now, the fact that people are even discussing, they've gone as far as looking at numbers in Parliament, doesn't this send a signal that probably consensus is lacking?
Well, first of all,
now then we talk